Hi, welcome to Youth's Culture and Risk, Soccer 3220. This is the first lecture where I'm basically doing a broad introduction into youth studies. We're doing it in three parts: what is youth studies, and figures of youth, and artifacts of expertise. So let's get straight into it. So to begin with, I think it's a good idea to watch that old current affairs video from the Chaser. It's quite old now, but it kind of outlines the perspective that we're taking here, the kind of we're kind of criticizing the mainstream moral panicky view of young people that these kind of memes here show as well. Young people are blamed for a lot of stuff in society, much of which they have absolutely no control over. So I think, yeah, stop now and have a look at that link. Check out that goes for about 5 or 6 minutes. It kind of takes the piss out of the way current affairs and news kind of present the lives of young people, and particularly kind of also satirizes experts. Often the experts you hear talking about young people don't seem to actually know much about their lives. So that's a good place to start. And you can see here the memes kind of say young people are constantly blamed for killing this and not understanding that and all that kind of stuff. So it's a good kind of primer for thinking about what we're looking at in the course. Because youth studies is a particular orientation towards young people. So we can think of youth, those kind of age categories in terms of welfare state and Centrelink and the UN, kind of 15 to 28. But much of the research in youth studies shows that kind of transitional period from being a child to an adult, which is meant to be captured by a youth in that 15 to 28 period, much of the kind of mechanisms to kind of count what's being an adult, getting your own place to live, getting married, having kids, getting a full-time job, are happening later than 28, into the 30s and 40s, and maybe not happening at all. So we kind of think of youth in youth studies as more of a concept, really, to think about that transitional period. And throughout the course, we'll be looking at lots of different ways to consider that. So it's kind of generally seen as that kind of transitional period between child and adult, but as you'll see in the course, youth studies itself has kind of started to trouble that understanding. A very kind of common used source in the field is, and to kind of think about the very understanding of what the term youth means, comes from a kind of short piece written by Pierre Bourdieu, where he kind of says youth is just a word. Basically, he kind of outlines in that piece that there's a power division between older and younger. The older are kind of constantly controlling the young, and labeling people youth is kind of a way of keeping them in their place. And some of you will understand too that kind of resonates with techniques of control and governmentality that I'll talk about in the third part of the lecture today. So youth here is a kind of form of symbolic violence, particularly because within that category of young people, there's so many different kind of types of people, right? There's class, race, gender, geographical, sexuality, disability differences, that labeling those people the same, particularly when done through the language of generations, really does kind of overemphasize the sameness and tend to underestimate the differences. So with the idea that youth is just a word, we're going to be using it a lot throughout the course and using it in a lot of different ways. So it's kind of inevitable. You're always kind of abusing language when you're using it. But we'll be using it in that kind of generalized term sometimes to talk about generationally. We'll talk about specific kinds of youth. We'll be sometimes talking about specific types of jobs. We'll be looking at class, race, and gender. So just keep that in mind when we're using the term throughout the semester. But importantly, broadly, youth studies wants us to kind of critically engage with much of the public kind of distortion and moral panic kind of representation of young people. So youth itself is often seen as a problem for experts to control or regulate and fix. But a lot of that doesn't seem to be necessarily about making young people more happy or satisfied or having a good life. It seems to be as much about making them like a good, more disciplined student or a good worker or a flexible worker these days. So, we're going to treat youth as an amorphous group. We're going to look at the differences, but we're also kind of going to defend, I suppose, young people generally from some of these kind of overt public political media critiques. So youth studies tends to be research not really done on or about young people. We kind of try and position our research as being done with young people, presenting their worldview, including them in the research itself, not just kind of doing research on them. So you'll find lots of research that's kind of about young people, youth or young person will be in the title. But youth studies research tends to be specifically, more understanding of their structural position, and more to kind of trying to get an understanding of their actual lives, rather than trying to fix them or make them fit in particular boxes or make them better workers or students or whatever. So much of the work that isn't youth studies that includes young people or youth in it, youth studies tends to critically engage with, because it tends to ignore their structural position, tends to ignore wider socio-economic positions, and tends to individualize and blame them for various problems, and tends to buttress those governmental and moral panic perspectives. So within youth studies as a field of research, there's kind of traditionally been two strands, the youth culture and the youth transitions perspectives. More contemporary research today tries to bring that stuff together. It doesn't separate it as much, but there has kind of been two areas in the past. So transition stuff has looked at that kind of more social, kind of economic side of things, I suppose, around work and education transitions, different opportunities, notions of deviance and relationships and family and stuff in there. Youth cultures just tend to look at more consumption practices, leisure, sport, music, fashion, media and technology and that kind of stuff. And already you can see when I'm explaining those kind of two fields, how, much of the stuff overlaps. So there's been a kind of real effort to bring those things together in recent years. So historically, in terms of youth transitions, researchers tend to focus on these three specific areas, which, have kind of been shown in the past, I suppose, to happen in this kind of linear straight line. School to work transitions, careers and jobs, domestic transitions, about our relationships, about getting married, about having kids, and housing transitions, kind of leaving the family home and then, getting a place of your own. Again, the traditional representation of this trajectory from being a child to a youth to an adult is a kind of linear straight line. You're born, you go to school, you get a job, you get married, you have a family, you retire, you die. Much of the kind of research that's happened over the past 20 or 30 years in youth transitions area has kind of challenged this lineality for lots of different reasons. So, there's questions about how quickly children have to grow up. Some say it's earlier because it's kind of, have to deal with sex and drugs and you have to kind of apparently decide what you're going to do in kindergarten for a job now. And there's all these kind of large scale existential problems like terrorism and global warming that young people and children know about earlier and earlier. But others kind of point out that maybe growing up is happening later. Young people are dependent on their parents for longer and living at home for longer. Things are more expensive. It's harder to get a job. Definitely harder to get a full-time job. In relation to that, people are putting off getting married and having kids much later because it's actually an economic responsible thing to do. So there's a kind of two things going at once here in the orientation towards whether this transition is kind of happening faster or slower. And so we kind of tend to see that transition now not as so much as a linear process, but more non-linear process. In terms like extended transitions, decoupled, blurry, zigzag transitions are used to think about this kind of one step forward, two step back kind of process of moving from that child to an adult. Because as I said, many of those traditional markers of adulthood are happening much later in life now. So all these kind of traditions, those three traditional areas are extending, and the kind of those kind of key areas of relationships and housing and school to work, the blending of those things are kind of complicating the picture, I suppose. So people might, leave school and go to uni and get a job and find that they don't like that and go back and study, or get in a relationship where you stay at home and the partner goes and has out into the workforce. Or you might get a job and work full time and have to live at home with your parents because this rental market's out of control and you certainly can't afford to buy a house. Again, that linearity of those three things isn't happening. No kind of boxes ticked off in a row. There's kind of a to and froing, a coming and going in these things. In relation to what I was saying about the public face of this before, much of the blame is placed on individual young people. The kind of critical concept of individualization sees that young people are expected and under pressure and constantly kind of told from an early kind of stage, increasingly even in like primary school, that, it's all about making the right choices, to have a trajectory towards a successful life. So the very idea of individual choice becomes a way of thinking of navigating yourself through life, but those largely social and economic factors are kind of taken out of the picture when it comes to blame, you know, why there's no secure work or why the housing market is out of control and all these kind of things. What tends to replace structural and economic actual analysis of these problems is kind of moral panic blaming, where kind of older adults kind of blame young people and say, back in my day, you know, we just had to work hard and buy a house, even though it now costs like 7 times more compared to wages and all that kind of thing. So the transitions area is one important thing to consider, and we'll look at aspects of that throughout the course. And the other one has been youth cultures, and some of you have seen this slide before. Youth cultures tend to be that area of research where we look at young people's more leisure practices, creative practices. It's a key site where young people form their identity in that kind of later kind of parts of socialization away from the family and in school, I suppose, and towards being an adult. So particularly subcultures have been an important thing here, looking at those kind of things like punk and goth, and you know, the development into neo-tribes where resistance and creativity is symbolic and it's done through rituals. And I think most students in this course will be familiar with that kind of thing now. But particularly youth cultures are good for thinking about where young people form relationships, try and meet other people like them. And they're good places for thinking about those tensions in the world between, you know, power and resistance, between notions of like mainstream consumption and subculture or authenticity and commodification, creativity and conformity. So again, we'll look at aspects of kind of youth cultures, not all subcultures, different aspects of it throughout the course. And it's been, you know, a very key and interesting part of youth studies. Much of the more recent work tries to bridge the gap between these two things, and you'll see that the stuff presented throughout the course is mostly like that. So, you know, kind of need to have a bit more of a cultural understanding than transition stuff, and more transitions understanding the cultural stuff, and particularly how they kind of affect each other, you know. So the idea of rites of passage, for instance, you know, lots of that kind of growing up happens, you know, in pubs and clubs or in sporting venues and stuff like that, which is actually leisure. Not all those markers of adulthood just happen, you know, in terms of getting a job or getting married. There's other things that are going on. So the research around rites of passage has been really good there to think about aspects of how these two things should be thought of together rather than separate. Lastly, throughout the course, I'm just kind of flagging this now, that one of the key conceptual things we'll be drawing upon a lot are these kind of new understandings of labour. So, you know, understand particularly not just about work, but the way that young people themselves create value in the economy. So I'm not going to go into this too much now, but I'm just flagging these kind of different understandings of labour up now, because throughout the rest of the semester, we'll be talking about them. So it's good to understand them now. Emotional labour, Hochschild is particularly relevant in the feminist work we'll be looking at about gender and sexuality throughout the course. This is where women in particular are expected to manage people's feelings and expressions as part of a job, and that work itself is often defined as women's work. Emotional labour is a key concept for thinking about aspects of that. Free labour by Terranova is a way of thinking about what we do on the web, where like every click and everything we buy and every comment we make is a piece of data that we do for free. We're actually working for those companies for free when we're, you know, commenting on videos or writing reviews. We're doing all this labour for these multinational digital corporations for free. And they use that data then to kind of sell stuff back to us. Immaterial labour is a way of thinking about what young people bring to work, particularly in areas of kind of sexy, edgy, cool places of bars and rock music and the art world, where young people's tastes, their bodies, their images, their fashions actually add to the value of that venue, but they're not really paid for it. So we'll get into aspects of that throughout the semester as well. Lastly, effective labour is the idea that we pretty much invest all of our subjectivity into work these days. One of the things we'll talk about is passion, in the idea that you now have to be passionate about work. You have to kind of almost define your whole life in relation to your job. You have to invest yourself in your job to be like a valuable person. So this is particularly important when the product of the work is the production of effects and emotions. And you can see here how this relates back to Hochschild and the other free and immaterial labours that I've been talking about. So these transpersonal effects, these production of symbols and meanings and identities, this particular part of new ways of thinking about work that we'll come up quite a bit throughout the semester. Okay, so I'll leave that there. Please have a look at the readings this week, and I'll move on to part 2, which is looking at figures of view.